I never thought I'd spend 3 nights parked in a rental car down the street from my own house, watching the lights go on and off through binoculars. My name is Ray Hollingsworth. I'm 47 years old, a pipeline inspector for an energy company based out of Edmonton. It's the kind of job most people don't know exists until something goes wrong. I travel to remote sites across northern Alberta and BC, checking integrity on transmission lines, writing reports, flagging problems before they become disasters. I'm good at it, been doing it for 19 years. The pay is decent, the work is solitary, and I'm away from home roughly 2 weeks out of every 4. My wife Sandra and I split up 4 years ago. No drama, no affair, just 2 people who grew into different versions of themselves and ran out of things to say over dinner. We sold the house in Sherwood Park and I bought a semi-detached in Spruce Grove, close enough to the depot, quiet street, good neighbors. It's not fancy. 2 bedrooms, a single garage, a backyard I keep meaning to do something with. But it was mine, and after the divorce, that word meant more than it used to. I was somewhere north of Fox Creek on November 3rd when my phone rang. I almost didn't pick up. Cell signal up there is unreliable, and I was in the middle of a field inspection report that was already overdue. But I recognized the area code as local Edmonton, so I stepped out of the trailer and answered. The voice on the other end was calm but careful. It was the coordinator from my home insurance company, a woman I'd spoken to exactly once before when I filed a claim for a broken basement window 2 years ago. Ray, I'm calling about something that came up on our quarterly review. Your property's energy consumption profile has flagged. We run automated comparisons for properties on extended absence riders, and yours has been pulling significantly more power than your baseline for the past 6 weeks. We want to make sure everything's okay. I stood in the field with wind cutting through my jacket and tried to make sense of what she was saying. I'd signed up for the extended absence rider when I took the job. It reduces your premium if you formally notify the insurance company when the property will be unoccupied for more than 14 consecutive days. I always let them know when I was heading out on a long rotation. It was one of the few administrative things I actually stayed on top of. What do you mean flagged? My furnace runs on a timer even when I'm gone. We understand that. But this isn't furnace-level consumption. We're looking at usage consistent with regular daytime occupancy, multiple appliances, frequent cycling. We just want to confirm you haven't rented the property or had family staying there. I hadn't, I told her that. There was a brief silence, the kind that communicates more than words do. Ray, I think you might want to check on your property. I finished the inspection that afternoon, drove back to Edmonton overnight, and pulled into a Tim Hortons near St. Albert at 5 in the morning with a large coffee and a knot in my stomach that wouldn't quit. I didn't go straight home. I don't know exactly why. Instinct maybe. Something told me that walking in the front door wasn't the right move yet. Instead, I drove past slowly, just once. No headlights, windows up. My street is curved, so I had a clear angle on the front of my house from about 4 properties away. The porch light was on, which I expected, it's on a timer. But the light in the spare bedroom was on too, and that one wasn't on any timer. I'd left that bulb burned out. I parked on the next street over and sat there for an hour. At 6:42 in the morning, a light came on in the kitchen. Then I saw a shape move past the window. Someone moving around in my kitchen at a comfortable pace, like they belonged there. I drove to a hotel near the Whitemud and checked in. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for a long time. There's a particular feeling you get when your sense of reality slips a little. Not panic, not anger, it comes later. At first, it's just a kind of cold, flat disbelief. That's my house. I bought that house. I painted the trim on those windows myself, and someone is standing in my kitchen at 7 in the morning making what is probably my coffee. I called the non-emergency line for the Edmonton Police Service. The officer I spoke with was thorough and patient, which I appreciated, but what he said frustrated me. Mr. Hollingsworth, we can absolutely do a wellness check, but if someone's inside with a key and they don't show signs of forced entry, the situation gets complicated from a legal standpoint. If they claim to have permission to be there, it becomes a civil dispute until we can establish otherwise. It helps enormously if you have documentation, evidence of unauthorized access, records of who's coming and going, anything that establishes this isn't a legitimate arrangement. I thanked him and hung up. I understood the logic even if I hated it. The next morning I drove to a Home Depot that opened early and bought 2 indoor wireless cameras, a doorbell camera and a small trail camera designed for hunting. The kind with a casing that blends into a bookshelf or a corner shelf. I also picked up a prepaid tablet from a Walmart nearby. I knew from the insurance call that whoever was in my house followed some kind of daytime schedule, so at 9:45 that morning, I went around the back, let myself in through the side door, and moved through my own home as quietly as I could. The violation was immediate and physical. There were dishes on the drying rack that weren't mine. 3 mugs. A cast iron pan I didn't own. The kitchen smelled faintly of someone else's cooking. Something with cumin maybe, or curry. The refrigerator had food in it I hadn't bought. A bag of groceries on the counter with a no-frills receipt dated 2 days ago. I walked through each room. The living room had been rearranged slightly. My couch was at a different angle and there was a throw blanket on the armrest in a pattern I didn't recognize. On the coffee table was a library book from the Spruce Grove Public Library with a return date 2 weeks out. Someone had borrowed a library book. Someone was comfortable enough in my home to borrow a library book. The spare bedroom, the one with the lit window, had been set up as sleeping quarters. My storage boxes had been moved to the closet and stacked neatly. The daybed I used to store off-season clothes on had been cleared and made up with fresh bedding. There was a small alarm clock on the windowsill, a phone charger plugged into the wall, and a toiletry bag open on the dresser. My own bedroom looked untouched at first glance, but when I checked the bathroom, there was a second toothbrush. Someone was using my bathroom, sharing my bathroom without knowing it. The thought of it made me feel physically ill in a way I hadn't expected. I set the cameras up carefully. The trail camera went behind the shelf of paperbacks in the living room, angled toward the front entrance. One wireless camera went in the kitchen, tucked above the cupboards near the ceiling. The doorbell camera replaced mine at the front. I set up motion alerts on the tablet and left it running from the hotel. I didn't clean up, didn't move anything. I wanted whoever was staying there to have no reason to think anything had changed. At 2:17 that afternoon, the doorbell camera picked up motion. I opened the app on my tablet and watched. A man in his early 40s walked up my front path in what looked like a work bag over one shoulder. He was wearing a Carhartt jacket, dark jeans, work boots. He looked genuinely like someone coming home after a long day. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a key, my key, and let himself in without hesitation. I watched through the interior cameras as he put the groceries away in my refrigerator. He took off his boots at the door, which is something I always do too, and it was such a normal gesture that it made the whole thing worse somehow. He poured himself a glass of water from my tap and sat down on my couch and opened his laptop. I recorded everything. Over the following 3 days, I watched him come and go. He left most mornings between 8 and 9, returned in early afternoon. He cooked dinner, watched TV, went to bed early. On the second evening, he had a video call at my kitchen table that lasted about an hour. I couldn't hear it through the microphone, but I could see him laughing, gesturing, relaxed, completely at home. On the third day, a woman came by. She knocked, which surprised me. She didn't have a key. He let her in, and they sat together at my kitchen table with papers spread between them. She had a laptop open and was showing him something on the screen. At one point, she pulled out a folder and they went through what looked like a stack of printed forms together. I captured screenshots every few minutes. On one image, I managed to zoom in enough to see the top of a document she'd set aside. It had a header with what looked like a business name, and below that what appeared to be an address. My address. I started searching that night. On Vrbo first, then Airbnb, then a few smaller platforms. I typed in my address. It was on the third platform I checked. My house, my living room in the listing photos, the throw blanket visible on the couch, the backyard I'd taken a photo of 2 summers ago when I'd finally cleared the fire pit area. The description called it a quiet retreat in a family-friendly Spruce Grove neighborhood, perfect for contractors, out-of-town professionals, or extended stays. Midterm rental. Utilities included. The weekly rate was listed at $950. There were reviews, 11 of them all positive, going back about 2 months. Clean, comfortable, easy access. Host was communicative and responsive, felt like home. Host, I sat in that hotel room and read every review twice. Some of them mentioned the garage access, which I hadn't even considered. Someone had been parking in my garage. The woman who'd come by turned out to be easier to identify than I expected. On the 4th day, when they said goodbye at the front door, the camera picked up a bit of their exchange. She was going to handle the next check-in, he said. The guest coming Thursday would need the lockbox code. He'd update it by Wednesday. Lockbox. They'd installed a lockbox on my property. I'd been so focused on how someone had gotten a key that I hadn't thought about how they were managing ongoing guest access. I searched for the man's face across LinkedIn and Facebook, pulling screenshots from the clearest camera frames I had. It took a while. He appeared on a community Facebook group for a town about 40 kilometers east of Edmonton, tagged in a photo at a local event 18 months ago. His name was posted in the caption. I'll call him by what appeared there, Kirk Dempsey. His profile was mostly private, but what I could see suggested he was in property management of some kind. His LinkedIn listed him as a short-term rental consultant. The woman I found through a local business directory. Her company, 2-person operation, offered professional listing management for rental properties. Photos, copywriting, guest communication. I found my own listing on their portfolio page. They'd used it as a sample of their work without apparently knowing or caring that the property wasn't legitimately theirs to manage. But the part I couldn't figure out was still the key. How did Kirk have a key to my house? Who had given it to him? I went back through the camera footage and watched every arrival and departure again. On the 6th day of surveillance, something caught my eye. A truck had pulled up around noon while Kirk was out. An older man got out, walked up to the front door and used a key. He was inside for maybe 15 minutes, then left. He was wearing a shirt with a logo on the chest. Dark background, white text and graphic. I enhanced the screenshot as much as the resolution would allow. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. A stylized house graphic above the words Ridgeview Home Services. I searched it and found the company website immediately. Property maintenance and caretaking services for the Edmonton and Spruce Grove areas. Seasonal checkups, furnace inspections, snow clearing, emergency response. The kind of company you hire when you're away and you need someone to keep an eye on things. I had hired them 18 months ago, when I started my current rotation schedule. They did a monthly walkthrough of my property and reported back to me with photos. I had their spare key. I had given them my schedule every time I was going to be away for more than 10 days. I called the main number for Ridgeview and asked to speak with the owner. The woman who answered said he was on a job and offered to take a message. I gave a fake name and said I was interested in their services and could they tell me who did the property walkthrough for the Spruce Grove area. She gave me a name without hesitation. I thanked her and hung up. He was a contract employee, not a full-time one. His name was listed on the Ridgeview site in our team photo from what looked like a staff event a year or so ago. Middle-aged, friendly look, the kind of person you'd trust with a key. That was enough. I called Detective Services at the Edmonton Police Service and asked to file a formal report. The detective I was connected with took my call seriously from the first minute. She asked me to come in the next morning with everything I had. I printed out screenshots. I burned the camera footage to a USB drive. I printed the listing pages, the reviews, the dates. I brought the insurance flagging notice. I had 11 days of documentation. The detective listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Mr. Hollingsworth, this is well documented. What you're describing is a fraud scheme involving theft of property access, unauthorized use of residential property, and depending on how far this goes, potentially breach of trust on the part of your caretaking company's employee. This isn't small. Are there other properties? I asked. That's what we're going to find out. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Within a week, the detective had contacted Ridgeview's ownership and identified which properties the contract employee had access to and what their absence schedules looked like. There were 3 other homeowners affected, all of them working professionals who traveled regularly. One was a nurse who did stints at remote healthcare facilities in northern BC. One was a pilot. One was an oil sands worker on a 2-week rotation schedule nearly identical to mine. The contract employee, I'll call him Warren, though that's not what I'm using publicly, had been passing schedule information and key access to Kirk for what the investigation eventually determined was a cut of the rental income. Kirk handled the guests. His partner managed the listings online. Warren picked the properties, managed the access, and stayed hands-off enough that he figured it wouldn't come back to him. They'd made close to $60,000 across the 4 properties in roughly 14 weeks. The arrest happened on a Tuesday in late November. I wasn't there for it. The detective called me that evening to let me know. Kirk and his partner had both been at my property when officers arrived. There was a guest checking in. The guest, a man from out of province visiting for work, had booked in good faith through the platform and had no idea the situation was fraudulent. He was mortified. Kirk was charged with fraud over $5,000, break and enter, theft of services, and mischief to property. His partner faced charges related to her role in managing the listings and collecting revenue she knew to be from unauthorized rental activity. Warren was charged with breach of trust and fraud. All 3 entered not guilty pleas initially, but the evidence was what it was. The trial happened the following spring. I testified once, for about 90 minutes, walking the court through the camera footage and documentation. Kirk's defense tried to argue that without physical damage to the property, the harm was minimal. The Crown responded by walking the judge through the financial records, the revenue collected, the utility costs downloaded onto homeowners, the emotional and psychological harm of having strangers living in your private space without your knowledge or consent. The judge wasn't moved by the minimal harm argument. Kirk received 22 months in provincial custody and 3 years probation. His partner received 14 months. Warren, who cooperated with investigators and provided detailed testimony about the scheme, received a conditional sentence and 2 years probation. All 3 were ordered to pay restitution split across the 4 affected homeowners. My share came to just over $11,000, which covered the utility overage, the cost of replacing my locks and installing a permanent security system, and a portion of the income they'd collected from renters staying in my home. I won't pretend the money felt like closure. It didn't. The thing about this kind of violation is that it doesn't feel like a robbery. If someone had smashed a window and taken my laptop, I'd have been angry, I'd have filed a report, I'd have replaced the laptop and moved on. This was different. This was sustained and intimate. Someone had been sleeping in my house, making meals in my kitchen, having conversations at my table, taking long showers in my bathroom, living inside the four walls I went to work every day to pay for, and feeling completely comfortable doing it. The nurse I mentioned, one of the other victims, told me that she'd found a grocery list on her kitchen notepad that wasn't her handwriting. Whoever had been staying at her place had just used her notepad like it was theirs. That detail hit me harder than almost anything else in this whole experience. These people had just walked into our lives and made themselves at home. They didn't think of us as people whose privacy they were violating. We were just absent, just gone, just a resource they hadn't paid for. Ridgeview Home Services survived the fallout, but barely. The owners maintained they had no knowledge of Warren's activities, and the investigation found nothing to contradict that. But several of us terminated our contracts, and word gets around in smaller communities. They downsized significantly. There were civil proceedings as well. I won't go into detail, but the settlement was enough to feel like some accountability reached the company level, even if the owners themselves weren't charged. I still live in that house. I thought about selling. I stood in the spare bedroom one afternoon about 2 months after the arrest, looking at the daybed that had been someone's bed for weeks, and I genuinely considered whether I could keep living there. But I'd bought that house after my marriage ended, and I'd decided when I signed those papers that I wasn't going to let loss define where I lived anymore. I wasn't going to let Kirk Dempsey and his operation take that from me too. So I stayed. I replaced the locks completely, deadbolts, door handles, the side door, the garage. I installed a permanent camera system with a monitored service. I terminated my caretaking contract and switched to a smart lock with a pin I control remotely. My neighbor to the left, a retired school teacher named, well, I know her as my neighbor, has my cell number and knows to call me directly if anything at the house seems off. She was the first person I told when it was all over. She said she'd seen a truck she didn't recognize there a few times but figured I'd arranged it. I told her to never figure that again. Call first, assume nothing. I monitor my utilities now. I have alerts set up through the electricity provider that notify me if my usage spikes more than 15% above my seasonal baseline. I check the major rental platforms every few months and search my own address. It takes 5 minutes, and I wish I'd done it from the moment I started traveling for work. The oil sands worker, another one of the victims, told me something when we spoke briefly during the legal process. He said the worst part wasn't the break-in, or even the money. The worst part was that he'd told exactly one company his schedule, trusted exactly one set of people with his key, and that trust had been the vector. The thing he'd done to protect his home had been the thing that made him vulnerable. I think about that a lot. Here's what I know now that I didn't know before. If you travel for work and you own property, your absence is a pattern. Patterns can be learned by people who are paying attention. Anyone who has access to your schedule, and I mean anyone, is someone who either has your trust absolutely or shouldn't have your information at all. A caretaking company, a property manager, a contractor you've told when you'll be home. That information has value to the wrong person, and you'll never know who the wrong person is until it's too late. Install cameras, not because you're paranoid, but because documentation is the only thing that stands between a complaint and a conviction. The detective told me directly, without my footage, this case would have been significantly harder to prosecute. The cameras were what made it real in a courtroom. Monitor your utilities. The insurance flag was the first thing that told me something was wrong. If I hadn't signed up for that extended absence rider, I might have noticed the utility spike on my bill 3 months later and just assumed my furnace had a problem. Search your own address on rental platforms. I'm serious. Airbnb, Verbo, Rentals.ca, whatever's active in your area. It takes 5 minutes. I had 11 positive reviews on a listing for my own home and had no idea. Someone had photographed every room and described the neighborhood and answered guest questions in a made-up host persona for months, and I didn't know because I'd never thought to look. Tell your neighbors your situation, not your schedule. Don't post your departure dates anywhere you don't have to. But tell the people nearest your property that you travel for work, that no one should be coming and going regularly, and that if they see something that seems off, you want to call directly. Mrs. Patterson, in the original story that inspired a lot of people to share their own experiences, was trying to help. The difference between someone mentioning something to a property coordinator and someone calling you directly is the difference between months of fraud and catching it early. Change how you manage key access. Smart locks with temporary codes are not expensive. A lockbox whose combination you control remotely costs less than a weekend away. Anything that means you don't have a physical key sitting in a company's filing cabinet somewhere is worth the inconvenience. Finally, if you discover something like this, don't confront it alone and don't wait. I know the impulse is to drive home, bang on the door, and throw someone out. I felt that impulse at 6 in the morning sitting in a Tim Hortons parking lot, furious and exhausted. But the detective was right. Evidence first. Document everything you can before you change a single lock or say a single word. Because once you confront and they're gone, the paper trail gets a lot harder to build. I drove past my old neighborhood last fall. Different reason, long story, and I ended up on my street by accident. I slowed down in front of my house and just looked at it for a minute. The lights were off. The porch was quiet. The backyard had the same overgrown look it always does before the first frost. Still mine. That matters more than I thought it would. If you're reading this and you're somebody who spends weeks away from home for work because you're on a rig or in a hospital or behind a wheel or on a flight deck, please do not assume that a locked door is enough. It wasn't enough for me or for the 3 other people who lost their privacy and their peace of mind to a scheme built on the fact that we trusted people we shouldn't have trusted blindly. Protect your space. Document everything. And if something feels wrong, even something as quiet as an insurance flag or a utility spike, trust that feeling before you rationalize it away. I almost didn't. I'm glad I didn't.